The sky over Pripyat wasn't red. It was a bruised, unnatural shade of violet. Captain Alexei Demidov stood on the bed of a moving Ural truck, his hand gripping the cold metal rail. He was 32, a man built of Soviet discipline and granite nerves, veteran of the Afghan mountains. But as the convoy rolled toward the silhouette of the power plant, he felt a primal chill that no bullet had ever provoked. "Don't breathe too deep, Cap," Private Volodya whispered beside him, pulling a thin, useless gauze mask over his face. "They say the air tastes like metal." Alexei didn't respond. He tasted it already. A sharp, acidic tang on the back of his tongue, like licking a copper coin. They arrived at the gates of hell at 0400. The world was a chaotic symphony of roaring engines, shouting officers, and the frantic clicking of Geiger counters, a sound that would soon become the soundtrack of Alexei's nightmares. His mission was simple on paper, yet suicidal in reality. Coordinate the liquidators on the roof of Reactor 4. "Listen up!" Alexei roared over the din, facing his platoon. These weren't just soldiers. Some were reservists, fathers and teachers called up in the middle of the night. "You go up there, you shovel for 90 seconds, and you run back. No more. If you stay for 2 minutes, you're a dead man walking. Do you understand?" The men looked at him with hollow eyes. They were dressed in makeshift lead suits that weighed 40 kilograms, looking like medieval knights in a sci-fi dystopia. Alexei was the first to ascend. When he reached the roof, the scale of the disaster hit him like a physical blow. Below him lay the exposed core, a glowing, jagged wound in the earth, breathing out invisible fire. The graphite blocks, the black birds as the men called them, were scattered everywhere. Each one emitted enough radiation to kill a man in minutes. "Go! Go! Go!" Alexei screamed, timing the first pair of liquidators. He watched as a young boy, barely 20, scooped up a chunk of graphite. The boy stumbled, his glove tearing against a jagged edge of debris. For a second, his bare skin was exposed to the ionized air. Alexei saw the boy's face pale instantly. In that moment, Alexei realized they weren't fighting a fire or a war. They were fighting an enemy that didn't bleed, didn't scream, and didn't care for bravery. It was an enemy that dismantled the very cells of your being. As the sun began to rise through the radioactive haze, Alexei looked at his own hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from the first touch of the invisible fire. He had a wife, Elena, waiting for him in Kiev, and a daughter who had just learned to walk. He wondered, with a sudden, agonizing clarity, if he would ever be allowed to touch them again, without bringing death home in his skin. The graphite was heavy, unnaturally so. It felt as if the stones themselves were anchored to the abyss by the weight of the atoms they held. Alexei stood at the threshold of the roof, his stopwatch a ticking judge in the palm of his hand. "Group 4, prepare!" he yelled, his voice muffled by the thick rubber of his respirator. The men lined up. They had stitched lead plates to their aprons, protected their groins with scraps of heavy metal, and wore goggles that fogged up with every panicked breath. They looked like ghosts haunting a graveyard of concrete and steel. "You have 90 seconds, Alexei reminded them, his eyes locking with a young private named Dmitro. "If you feel the metallic taste get stronger, ignore it. Just shovel. Do not look down into the core. If you look, you lose your soul." The whistle blew. The men scrambled onto the roof. It was a dance of desperation. Shovel, lift, throw. Shovel, lift, throw. The radiation was so intense it felt like a physical pressure against their chests, a heat that didn't come from the sun, but from the very air they displaced. Alexei watched as the film in his camera, if he had one, would have turned white from the invisible bombardment. Dmytro reached for a particularly large block of graphite. His shovel snapped. For a second, the young man froze, staring at the glowing debris. "Move!" Alexei screamed, stepping onto the forbidden zone himself to grab the boy by the shoulder. As he pulled Dmytro back, Alexei felt a strange sensation, a tingling, like thousands of microscopic needles piercing his skin simultaneously. It wasn't pain yet, but a terrifying vibration of his nerves. He looked at the stopwatch. 70 seconds. "Back to the stairs, now!" They tumbled back into the stairwell, gasping for air that wasn't heavy with isotopes. The clean zone felt like a lie. Dmytro ripped off his mask and vomited a gray, bile-streaked liquid. His face was already turning a deep, sunburned red, the nuclear tan that signaled the beginning of the end. "I touched it, Captain," he whispered, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't hold his water canteen. Alexei didn't have words of comfort. He looked at his own lead gloves. They were dusted with gray ash. He realized then that they weren't cleaning a roof. They were burying their own futures in the ruins of Reactor 4. That night, in the tent city of the Liquidators, the silence was heavier than the roar of the plant. Men sat in the dark, smoking cigarettes that tasted like copper, watching their own skin for the first sign of the burn. Alexei sat apart, writing a letter to Elena that he knew he could never mail. The sensors would burn it, just as the radiation was burning the marrow in his bones. "My dear Elena," he wrote by the light of a flickering torch, "the stars here are different. They don't twinkle, they glow with a cold blue light. I think I am becoming part of the machine."
The transition from hero to ghost happened in a single night. Alexei woke up in the barracks tent, but he didn't wake up to the sound of the siren. He woke up to the sound of his own heart, hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. When he tried to sit up, the world tilted. The familiar smell of the camp, diesel, cheap tobacco, and boiled cabbage, was replaced by a sickeningly sweet scent, like rotting fruit. He looked at his pillow. Clumps of short, dark hair lay there, detached from his scalp as if they had never belonged to him. "Captain?" It was Volodya, the private from the truck. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at his own hands. The skin was peeling in long, translucent strips, revealing a raw, weeping pink underneath. "My skin, it feels like it's too tight for my bones." Alexei stood up, ignoring the wave of nausea that threatened to buckle his knees. "Get dressed, Volodya. We have a shift." "The doctors said no more roof for us," Volodya whispered, his voice cracking. "They said our dose is full. They're putting us on the buses." The buses weren't the red and white city transports they had arrived in. These were military ambulances, windows blacked out with grime and soot. As Alexei walked toward them, he saw the black tulip trucks, usually reserved for the dead from Afghanistan, parked nearby. A cold realization washed over him. They weren't just being rotated out, they were being quarantined. As the convoy pulled away from the zone, Alexei looked back at the sarcophagus, the giant steel and concrete tomb they were building over Reactor 4. It looked like a gray mountain rising from a forest of dead, ginger-colored trees. "Where are we going, Cap?" Dmitri asked from the back of the bus. He looked skeletal, his eyes sunken into dark, bruised sockets. "To a hospital in Moscow, hospital number 6, Alexei said, though he didn't know if it was the truth. It was the only place he had heard of that dealt with this. The journey was a blur of fever and metallic thirst. When they finally arrived, they weren't greeted with medals or flowers. They were met by men in heavy rubber hazmat suits who stripped them naked in a cold concrete room. Their uniforms, the medals Alexei had won in the mountains, the letters from Elena in his pocket, were tossed into lead-lined bins. "Wait," Alexei croaked, as a medic grabbed his wedding ring. "That's mine!" "Everything is contaminated, Comrade Captain," the medic said, his voice metallic behind a filter. "Everything you touch is a weapon now, even your breath." Locked in a sterile white room, Alexei felt the walls closing in. He was a prisoner of his own DNA. He watched through a thick glass pane as nurses moved like deep-sea divers in the hallway. He tried to think of Elena, of the way her hair smelled like jasmine, but the radiation was erasing his memories, replacing them with the blue glow of the reactor. He realized then the ultimate cruelty of their sacrifice. They had saved the city, but they had become too toxic to ever live in it again. He was a hero that his country was now terrified to touch.
The radiation wasn't the only thing stripping Alexei of his life. The ink of the bureaucracy was just as corrosive. 2 weeks into his stay at hospital number 6, the door to his sterile room opened. It wasn't a doctor in a lead apron who entered, but a man in a sharp gray civilian suit. He carried a leather briefcase and a thin, unsettling smile. "Captain Demidov," the man said, staying carefully behind a yellow line painted on the floor, the boundary between the clean world and Alexei's radioactive breath. "How are you feeling?" "I feel like I'm melting from the inside out," Alexei croaked, his voice a dry rasp. "When can I see my wife? When do I get my discharge papers?" Volkov opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "That is why I am here. There has been a clerical adjustment regarding your service record at the Chernobyl Atomic Energy Station." Alexei squinted at the document. His heart sank. "This says I was stationed in Poliske. That's 30 kilometers from the plant. It says my radiation dose was 25 Roentgens. A safe, standard dose for a soldier in the field." Volkov nodded smoothly. "I was on the roof!" Alexei shouted, the effort causing a sharp pain in his chest. "I stood on the edge of the core. My Geiger counter hit the limit and broke. I took 500, maybe 600 Roentgens. My men, Dmitro, Volodya, they were right there with me." Volkov leaned in slightly, his eyes cold as Siberian ice. "Captain, let us be realistic. If we record the true numbers, the world will panic. The West will use it against us. You are a patriot, aren't you? A hero of the Soviet Union doesn't cause panic. He makes sacrifices." "My sacrifice was my health," Alexei spat, "not my truth." "Your truth is whatever the state requires it to be," Volkov replied, sliding a pen across the table. "Sign this. It confirms you were a support driver in the outer zone. In exchange, your family will receive a special pension. If you don't, well, the hospital bills for unspecified illnesses are very high, and your daughter's future in the academy might be difficult." Alexei looked at the pen. It felt heavier than the graphite blocks on the roof. He looked at his hands. The fingernails were black, the skin cracked. He was dying for a country that was already busy erasing his name from its history books.
He realized that the sarcophagus wasn't just made of concrete and steel, it was made of paper. They were burying the truth under layers of lies, just as they buried the reactor. "What about my men?" Alexei asked quietly. "They have already signed," Volkov lied. Alexei knew it was a lie, but he also knew the power of the machine. That night, after Volkov left, Alexei looked out the window. He could see the lights of Moscow, a city that slept soundly because men like him had stood in the violet glow of the atom. He realized then that he was a dead man twice over, once by the radiation and once by the hand of the state.
The apartment in Kiev smelled of jasmine and floor wax, the sense of a life Alexei no longer recognized. He stood in the doorway, his civilian clothes hanging loosely on a frame that had lost 15 kilograms in the Moscow wards. "Alexei?" Elena's voice was a whisper. She stood at the end of the hallway, clutching a dish towel. She didn't run to him. She didn't throw her arms around his neck. She stood still, her eyes searching his face, tracking the strange, sallow color of his skin and the way his hair had grown back in thin, colorless patches. "I'm home, Lena," he said, stepping forward. She instinctively took a half-step back. It was involuntary, a flash of pure, primal fear, but it cut Alexei deeper than any shard of graphite. "The doctors, they sent a pamphlet," she said, her voice trembling. "They said we have to wash your clothes separately. They said your dishes must be kept in a different cupboard. They said," she choked back a sob, "they said I shouldn't let little Oksana sit on your lap." At that moment, Oksana, barely 3 years old, toddled into the hallway. "Papa!" she squealed, her face lighting up with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child. She began to run toward him, her tiny arms outstretched. "No! Oksana, wait!" Elena cried, lunging forward to grab the child before she could reach him. Alexei froze. He held his hands out, but then quickly pulled them back, tucking them into his pockets as if they were loaded pistols. He saw the confusion in his daughter's eyes, the way she began to cry because her mother was holding her back from the hero she had been told was coming home. "I'm not a monster, Lena," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and grief. "I'm not glowing in the dark." "I know," she wept, still holding the struggling child. "I know you're not, but they don't tell us anything. The neighbors, they saw the military ambulance drop you off. They whispered that you're contagious. They say the liquidators bring the fire back with them." That night, Alexei sat alone in the kitchen. He drank tea from a glass that was now his glass, marked with a small piece of blue tape so no one else would touch it. He watched Elena through the cracked door as she scrubbed the hallway floor where he had walked, her movements frantic and desperate. He realized that the state had succeeded. They hadn't just erased his records, they had turned him into a pariah in his own home. He was a ghost haunting his own living room, a man who had saved the world only to find there was no place left for him in it. He looked at his medals, laid out on the wooden table. They looked like cold, dead eyes. He realized then that the invisible fire hadn't just burned his body, it had burned the bridge between him and the people he loved.
The world outside the zone was too loud, too fast, and too full of lies. By 1991, the empire Alexei had served was crumbling, its red flags being lowered for the last time. But for Alexei, the collapse had happened much earlier. He couldn't stand the pity in the doctor's eyes or the hidden fear in Elena's. He couldn't bear being the sick man who sat on the balcony watching a world that wanted to forget 1986. So he packed a small rucksack. He left his medals on the kitchen table, cold pieces of tin that meant nothing now. He left a note for Elena. "I am going where the air tastes like home." The zone didn't care about his lack of hair or his scarred lungs. As he crossed the perimeter, bribing a young bored guard with a bottle of vodka and a pack of Western cigarettes, Alexei felt a strange, heavy peace. The invisible fire was still here, humming in the soil and the rust, but here it was honest. He walked through Pripyat. The city was a skeletal remains of a future that never arrived. Trees grew through the floors of gymnasiums. Soviet slogans peeled off the walls like dead skin. He found a small wooden house in a village on the edge of the cooling pond, a place the map said didn't exist anymore. There were others there, Samoseli, the self-settlers, old women who refused to leave their ancestors' graves, and men with hollow coughs and steady hands. They didn't ask for his radiation dose. They didn't wash his dishes with separate soap. "You look like you've seen the roof, son," an old man named Ivan said, handing Alexei a glass of moonshine brewed from contaminated apples. "I was there," Alexei whispered. "I was a captain." "Here you are just a man," Ivan replied. "The dirt is poison, the water is heavy, but at least nobody here pretends it isn't." Alexei spent his final days sitting on the banks of the Pripyat River. He watched the sarcophagus in the distance, shimmering in the heat haze. It was his tomb, too, in a way. He had left his youth, his health, and his future inside that concrete shell. He no longer felt the metallic taste as a threat. It was a constant companion, a reminder that he had stood at the edge of the apocalypse and pushed it back, even if only by a few inches. One evening, as the sun set in that same bruised violet hue he remembered from the first night, Alexei felt a profound lightness. He wasn't a hero of the Union. He wasn't a victim of the ministry. He was a liquidator. He had seen the heart of the sun and survived long enough to tell the silence about it. He closed his eyes, his breath slowing to match the rhythm of the wind through the dead pines. He wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, he wasn't radioactive. He was just part of the earth again. The zone took him back, not as an enemy, but as its own.